For decades, if you needed a resistor, a cable adapter, or a radio antenna, there was only one place to go: RadioShack, the store with the instantly recognizable red and white sign on nearly every American street corner. At its peak in the late 1990s, RadioShack operated over 7,000 stores across the United States, employed over 40,000 people, and generated nearly $5 billion in annual revenue. The brand was synonymous with electronics retail. Then in February 2015, RadioShack filed for bankruptcy and announced it would close over 4,000 stores immediately. Within weeks, one of the most recognized retail brands in America effectively vanished. This is the story of how RadioShack went from being America's technology store to a retail ghost, and why its collapse holds urgent lessons about adaptation, strategic drift, and the fatal consequences of ignoring market changes you can see coming. The RadioShack story begins in 1921 in Boston, Massachusetts. Two brothers, Theodore and Milton Deutschmann, opened a small store to serve the rapidly growing community of amateur radio enthusiasts. The name RadioShack was a reference to the small wooden structure, a Radio Shack, that ham radio operators used to house their equipment. The store sold components, kits, and supplies that radio hobbyists needed to build and repair their own equipment. It was a niche business serving a passionate community. For decades, RadioShack remained focused on this core market. They sold vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, wire, antennas, and radio kits. The customers were serious hobbyists, engineers, and technicians who knew exactly what they needed. Profit margins were thin, but the business was stable. By the 1950s, RadioShack had expanded to 9 stores in the Boston area and developed a mail-order catalog business that served customers nationwide. But by 1962, RadioShack was struggling financially. The rise of television had reduced interest in ham radio. Consumer electronics were increasingly mass-produced rather than built from kits. The company faced bankruptcy. That's when Charles Tandy, a leather goods entrepreneur from Texas, stepped in. Tandy bought RadioShack for $300,000, seeing potential that others missed. His vision was to transform RadioShack from a niche hobbyist supplier into a mass-market consumer electronics retailer. Tandy's strategy was expansion through aggressive franchising and company-owned stores in shopping malls and strip centers. He positioned RadioShack as the convenient neighborhood electronics store, the place where average consumers could buy batteries, cables, and basic electronic devices without going to a department store. By 1970, RadioShack had grown to over 2,400 stores. By 1975, there were over 4,000. Tandy standardized store layouts, centralized purchasing, and developed RadioShack branded products that offered higher margins than name-brand goods. The strategy worked brilliantly during the 1970s and 1980s. RadioShack rode the personal computer revolution, selling the TRS-80 computer starting in 1977, one of the first mass-market personal computers available in retail stores. The TRS-80 became enormously successful, selling over 100,000 units in its first year and establishing RadioShack as a serious player in the emerging personal computer market. RadioShack stores became destinations not just for hobbyists, but for early technology adopters who wanted to explore the possibilities of home computing. Throughout the 1980s, RadioShack diversified into new product categories. They sold personal computers, mobile phones when they were still car-mounted units, CB radios, stereos, and an expanding array of consumer electronics. The stores remained focused on smaller devices and components, items that customers might need quickly and locally. Need a replacement cable for your stereo? RadioShack had it. Need batteries on Sunday when other stores were closed? RadioShack was open. The convenience factor, combined with a reputation for knowledgeable staff who could answer technical questions, made RadioShack a retail success. By the late 1990s, RadioShack was at its peak. The company operated over 7,000 stores across the United States, making it one of the largest retail chains in the country. Annual revenues approached $5 billion. The stores were profitable. The brand was strong. RadioShack seemed like a permanent fixture of American retail, as reliable as the post office and as ubiquitous as McDonald's. But beneath the surface, RadioShack's business model was already crumbling, and the warning signs were everywhere for those willing to see them. The retail environment was changing in ways that made RadioShack's core advantages obsolete. Big box retailers like Best Buy were opening massive stores that could stock a far wider selection of consumer electronics than a small RadioShack store. Internet retailers, led by Amazon, which launched in 1995, began selling electronics at prices that RadioShack couldn't match because Amazon had no physical stores to maintain. Even more fundamentally, the products RadioShack sold were changing in ways that eliminated the need for RadioShack's expertise. In the 1970s, if you wanted to connect a component stereo system, you needed cables, adapters, and knowledge of impedance and wiring. RadioShack sold all of that. By the 2000s, consumer electronics were increasingly wireless and plug and play. You didn't need a RadioShack employee to explain how to connect your iPod to your computer. It just worked. The technical knowledge that RadioShack staff provided became less valuable as products became simpler and more integrated. And RadioShack's response to these changes was catastrophic strategic drift. Instead of focusing on what made RadioShack unique, the company tried to become something it wasn't. In the early 2000s, RadioShack decided to chase higher-margin products like mobile phones. Stores that had once been filled with components and cables increasingly looked like miniature cell phone shops. RadioShack partnered with wireless carriers to sell mobile phone contracts, earning commissions on activations. The mobile phone strategy generated short-term revenue, but it destroyed RadioShack's identity. The hobbyists and engineers who had been loyal customers for decades walked into RadioShack stores and found that the components they needed had been removed to make room for phone displays. The sales staff, once knowledgeable about electronics, were now trained primarily to sell phone contracts. RadioShack had alienated its core customers without successfully attracting a new customer base. Because anyone who wanted a mobile phone could get one from the carrier directly or from a big box store with better selection and prices. RadioShack also made a disastrous decision to move away from its private label products. For decades, RadioShack had sold components and devices under its own brand, Realistic, Archer, and Micronta, among others. These products offered higher profit margins than name brand goods, but in an attempt to seem more mainstream, RadioShack reduced its focus on private label products and tried to compete by selling the same Samsung phones and Apple iPods that every other retailer sold. This put RadioShack in direct price competition with Walmart, Best Buy, and Amazon, a competition RadioShack could not win because its small store format meant higher costs per square foot. By 2010, RadioShack was in serious trouble, though the extent of the crisis wasn't yet public. Store sales were declining year after year. The company was closing unprofitable locations, but not fast enough to offset falling revenues. RadioShack had over 4,000 stores, but many were in declining malls or strip centers where foot traffic had collapsed. The real estate portfolio that had been an asset in the 1980s was now a massive liability, locking RadioShack into expensive leases for stores that couldn't generate sufficient revenue. Management tried several turnaround strategies, all of which failed. In 2013, RadioShack hired a new CEO who attempted to rebrand the company as The Shack and redesign stores to appeal to younger customers. The rebrand was widely mocked. Nobody called RadioShack The Shack except in RadioShack's advertising. The store redesigns were expensive but didn't address the fundamental problem, which was that RadioShack no longer had a clear reason to exist in a retail landscape dominated by Amazon and Best Buy. RadioShack also made a catastrophic mistake in its online strategy. While competitors were investing billions in e-commerce infrastructure, RadioShack treated its website as an afterthought. The RadioShack online store was clunky, poorly stocked, and offered no advantages over Amazon. RadioShack could have leveraged its thousands of physical locations to create an omnichannel strategy where customers could order online and pick up in store, or return online purchases at local stores. Best Buy successfully executed this strategy. RadioShack never did. The company spent the early 2000s, the critical years when online retail was emerging, essentially ignoring the internet. The financial pressure mounted relentlessly. RadioShack sales declined from $4.2 billion in 2012 to $3.4 billion in 2013. The company reported a net loss of $400 million in 2013. By 2014, RadioShack was burning through cash reserves and negotiating desperately with lenders to avoid bankruptcy. The stock price, which had been over $60 per share in 2005, fell below $2. In February 2015, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The company announced it would immediately close over 4,000 stores, laying off thousands of employees with minimal notice. The bankruptcy filing revealed the extent of the disaster. RadioShack had liabilities of $1.2 billion and assets of $1.03 billion. The company was effectively insolvent. Suppliers were owed hundreds of millions. Landlords held leases on thousands of soon-to-be empty storefronts. The bankruptcy process was brutal and quick. RadioShack's assets were sold to a hedge fund called Standard General, which attempted to continue operating a smaller chain of RadioShack stores in partnership with Sprint. The idea was to turn remaining RadioShack locations into Sprint mobile phone stores with a small section for RadioShack branded accessories. It was a last desperate attempt to extract value from the brand. It failed. By 2017, RadioShack filed for bankruptcy again. This time, there would be no rescue. The remaining stores were liquidated. The brand was sold off. By 2020, fewer than 400 RadioShack locations remained, mostly franchise stores operating independently in other countries or as tiny outposts inside other retail stores. The RadioShack that had once been synonymous with American electronics retail was gone. The human cost of RadioShack's collapse was significant. Over 30,000 employees lost their jobs, many of them long-term workers who had spent entire careers with the company. Store managers who had believed RadioShack was a stable employer found themselves unemployed in their 50s with skills that didn't easily transfer to other industries. Franchisees who had invested their savings into opening RadioShack stores lost everything when the company collapsed. But perhaps the most striking aspect of RadioShack's death was how predictable it was. The company faced no sudden external shock. There was no financial crisis, no natural disaster, no unexpected competitor. RadioShack died because it failed to adapt to changes that were visible years in advance. The rise of internet retail wasn't a surprise. Amazon launched in 1995. By 2000, it was obvious that online shopping would transform retail. RadioShack had over a decade to build a competitive e-commerce strategy and failed to do it. The shift to big-box electronics retailers wasn't a surprise either. Best Buy was opening massive stores throughout the 1990s. Circuit City, another big-box competitor, was expanding aggressively. RadioShack could see that consumers were shifting towards stores with wider selection and lower prices. The company could have consolidated its store base, closed unprofitable locations, and focused on niches where small-format stores still made sense. Instead, RadioShack tried to compete head-to-head with larger retailers while maintaining a bloated store base it couldn't afford. The decline of component electronics as a consumer activity was also predictable. By the 2000s, fewer people were building their own stereos or repairing their own TVs. Consumer electronics had become cheaper and more integrated, making repair and customization less common. RadioShack could have shifted focus to serve the maker movement, the growing community of hobbyists building drones, robots, and custom electronics. Companies like Adafruit and SparkFun built successful businesses serving this market. RadioShack, which had the brand recognition and retail presence to dominate this niche, ignored it in favor of selling cell phone contracts. What RadioShack's collapse reveals is a pattern that appears in many retail failures. The company succeeded by serving a specific need, convenient access to electronic components and devices. With a specific business model, small format stores with knowledgeable staff. When the market changed, RadioShack abandoned what made it unique and tried to compete in markets where it had no advantage. The company spent its final years trying to be a smaller, worse version of Best Buy and a slower, more expensive version of Amazon, instead of finding a niche where being RadioShack still mattered. There's a lesson here about strategic identity. RadioShack forgot what it was supposed to be. In trying to appeal to everyone, it appealed to no one. The hobbyists who had been loyal customers were alienated by stores filled with mobile phone displays. The mass-market customers RadioShack tried to attract could get better prices and selection at Walmart or online. RadioShack ended up in no man's land, a retailer without a clear value proposition. The bankruptcy also exposed the dangers of a physical retail footprint in a changing market. RadioShack's thousands of stores had been an asset when convenience mattered. Once internet shopping made location irrelevant, those stores became anchors dragging the company into bankruptcy. The leases couldn't be broken without penalty. The inventory in unprofitable stores still had to be purchased. The employees still had to be paid. RadioShack was locked into a cost structure built for a retail environment that no longer existed. Today, RadioShack exists mostly as a cautionary tale and an internet meme. The brand was purchased by various entities that have attempted to revive it as an online retailer or a cryptocurrency brand, ventures that have gone nowhere. A few dozen franchise stores still operate in small markets, selling phone accessories and batteries to customers who remember when RadioShack meant something. But walk through any American town that once had a RadioShack, and you'll see the ghost. The storefront is still there, usually empty or converted into a vape shop or a tax preparation office. The sign is gone, but the outline remains visible on the facade. It's a monument to a retail empire that couldn't adapt, wouldn't adapt, and paid the ultimate price for that failure. And the lesson for today's retailers is stark. The market will change, technology will change, customer expectations will change. The companies that survive are the ones that change with the market while preserving what makes them valuable. RadioShack preserved its store count while abandoning its identity. It should have done the opposite. Close the unprofitable stores, invest in e-commerce, and double down on serving the niche customers who actually valued what RadioShack offered. Instead, RadioShack tried to be everything to everyone, and ended up being nothing to anyone. Nearly a decade after RadioShack's bankruptcy, the retail landscape continues to shift. More traditional retailers have followed RadioShack into bankruptcy. Toys R Us, Sears, Payless Shoes, countless others. The pattern is almost always the same. A retailer that succeeded in the pre-internet era fails to adapt to online competition, tries to compete in markets where it has no advantage, and collapses under the weight of a physical footprint that no longer generates sufficient revenue. RadioShack's story isn't just about one company. It's about the brutal reality that no market position is permanent. No brand is too big to fail, and the strategies that built an empire can become the anchors that sink it. The hobbyists who built radios in their garages, the engineers who bought components at RadioShack for decades, they remember what the store used to be. But that RadioShack died years before the bankruptcy filing. Killed not by Amazon or Best Buy, but by RadioShack's own strategic failures and inability to remain RadioShack. Now tell me, did you remember when RadioShack was the place for electronics? Leave your opinion in the comments and suggest what other retail collapse or business failure you'd like to see analyzed. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support deep dives into the companies that rose, fell, and left lessons we ignore at our own peril.